I think we're just going to get started, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. So this is the Edinburgh Architectural Association's first online event, and also kicking off our series, Alternative Models of Architecture Practice. So we've got three speakers with us here tonight, and my colleague Gary is going to introduce them later. I just wanted to do some housekeeping to start with. So you might have noticed, if you are a follower of the EAA, that we've had a bit of a facelift recently. We launched our new website a couple of weeks ago, and that is showing all of our upcoming events, and we're also kind of trying to get all of our content on there. So if you want to find out more about what we do, who we are, or getting involved, then please visit eaa.org.uk. We are also on Instagram, eaa.edinburgh, and on Twitter, edinarcsoc, and we're on Facebook and LinkedIn as well, so you can get in touch with us through those channels. Just some Zoom housekeeping. Can we ask you to turn off your microphone and camera? We are kind of in control of all of that at the moment, so you won't be able to switch your microphone on during the event. We would recommend viewing in side-by-side mode when we are sharing the presentations on screen. You can see that through the screen share viewing options at the top center of your screen. There should be a little drop down. And side-by-side modes are quite nice to see the speaker and the presentation at the same time. Throughout the event, please feel free to use the chat function to ask questions, post comments, and you can find that in the bottom center of your screen. We will have someone backstage who's going to be keeping an eye on the chat function throughout the event, and she will pick out questions to feed back to our speakers when we come to the Q&A, and we may unmute you if you want to provide some more feedback or respond to a question that you've asked. If you do want to speak, you can use the raise hand option, or you can use the chat function and get in touch with the Edinburgh Architectural Association. We are going to be recording this event, and it will be made available online. It's been very, very popular, and we're sold out, so we will make it available online later. We have made this a free event. We know that with the COVID-19 pandemic going on, that some people are really struggling, so we didn't want to put price tickets out. However, we have set up a text donation campaign, and we would ask that if it's possible and affordable, if you could donate something for your ticket, that would be hugely beneficial to the EAA, and it would help us to continue putting on these events and to do the work that we do. So it's the donor text campaign, and if you can text EAA space and then followed by the amount that you would like to donate to 70085. So to donate £3, it would be EAA space 3 to 70085. And if you would like to opt out of the marketing, which unfortunately wasn't optional for me to switch off, text EAA no info and then the amount that you would like to donate to the same number. So the text would cost £3 plus one standard message rate. And I say it again, EAA no info to opt out of marketing communications. And we would really appreciate your donations. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to Gary now.
Thank you, Alice. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you fine.
Good, okay. Welcome everyone. I suppose I'll kick off by sort of talking a little bit about what has inspired this series. Our collective interest on the events team to get an insight into how some of our favorite architecture practices operate, how they're adapting their mode of practice to current challenges and seeking out innovative approaches. Our speakers tonight will question, are they practicing in an alternative fashion at all? Should enabling the youngest and most vulnerable in society to directly shape the spaces they live, work and play be seen as alternative? How can collective custom builds be more widely accessible? How can community land ownership become more commonplace? What excites me personally about each of these practices is the focus on creating a built environment that is directly influenced by those who will live, work, socialize and play there. Each of tonight's speakers will look at their own approach to practice, explain what inspired them to take the route they have taken, and share some challenges and rewards they have experienced. I welcome this evening Matt Springett and Fiona MacDonald of London-based studio Matt and Fiona to discuss education and live build. John Kinsley from John Kinsley Architects to discuss his approach to collective custom build. And finally, an insight into community land ownership and wider community engagement from Akiko Kobayashi. First up, I'll introduce Matt and Fiona. Matt and Fiona is an award-winning architecture education organization that asks the question, how many young people look around them and feel like they have had a say in what they see? Their practice enables the youngest and most vulnerable in our society to directly shape the spaces they live, work and play. I'll now welcome Matt and Fiona to share their screen and start once they feel ready. Matt and Fiona.
Thanks, Gary. Is that sharing now?
Not just yet.
Now?
It's just loading. Yes.
I'm just going to attempt full screen and then we're ready to go. So thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be speaking to you on this first evening. And I'm going to take the first few minutes, and then Fee's going to jump in. As Gary said, we're a young organisation working with young people between, I guess, ages of 5 and 18, and we, again, sort of Gary has touched on, we base what we do on this question, which is how many young people look around them and feel they have a say in what they see. And arguably that's a question we could all ask ourselves, and adults as well. And many of us probably don't have much of a direct say about the built environment in which we live, work and play. And we think about that question and find ways to empower those young people to shape their built environment. Our initiative has been, I'm going to touch on just a few sort of seeds that have influenced this 4-year-old initiative now, which is started by Fiona and I, who've been working together on and off, I guess indirectly, for about 10 years. But in the 4 years that we've worked together, we've now helped over 1,200 young people directly make structures and small buildings that impact their built environment. And over 125,000 people have experienced those spaces. So it's been a real journey in a very short period of time, and sort of happened by accident. Our backgrounds, which are through teaching and learning and making, have influenced a series of processes which put making and hands-on engagement at the sort of forefront. I've taught architecture in architecture school, particularly in first-year architecture, for many years until recently, and processes throwing young adults into the thick of things by asking them to explore the spaces they're working and operating in. These are some photographs of first-year installations which we ask students to do within the first 8 weeks of term. A lot of you will be familiar with these if you have a background in architecture. And getting people to work and think about those spaces very directly is an empowering process in itself, but it also not only enables those young people to think about the places in which they're working differently, it also it challenges them to work collaboratively. And that's been developed through our own practice, where we've always put R&D at the sort of center of that, collaboratively working in the built environment. This was a series of projects we had called Shelter, where we took ready-mades and to sites that we were operating on. This is structure made from hazel and rain jackets about 10 years ago now in Ireland on a restored castle we're working on. And then about 7 years ago, Fiona and I had some two individual experiences outside of our collaborative working, which I think are catalytic to what we do now and impact on how we think about that. One was a project called, for an organization called Beam in North America, which opens an opportunity for any creative to put forward an idea that they couldn't build themselves. And that might not be an architect, it could be a filmmaker, an artist, and 80 young people between 8 and 18 then build that structure. In this case, it was an imagined dream machine based on a story by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And a group of young people in New Hampshire built that structure over 4 weeks. And with a degree of kind of controlled risk management, they were able to do this entirely on their own with very little oversight from a group of adults. And in this organization's attempts were to think about processes as collaboration rather than design. And simultaneously to that, Fee, as part of her master's research, was looking at the sort of post-tsunami landscape in Japan, and working through a field trip with a group of school children who were evaluating or being asked to evaluate the spaces that were left over in the replanning of their city and towns. And a really interesting Renga exchange was sort of developed by Fee as part of her master's thesis, where young people were asked to talk about and map those landscapes. And it's a beautiful, one of those beautiful mappings which has sort of past and present and imagined futures drawn interwoven into that. And I think these two processes, one about making and one about a very direct way of communicating with young people to express ideas, were the seeds of a project which came about by accident 4 years ago when we approached the National Trust to do a brief summer school. And that's evolved into a practice now where we work with a whole number of young people on a range of projects. But we involve them right at the start of that process in the briefing, understanding what they need to build, usually with a cultural collaborative partner. And then we help them through a period of time to design that, often developing systems and methods which allow them to construct safely. And then we allow them to build that. I'm just going to slip through two projects and then let Fee take over as we move into the next one. The first was our sort of fully fledged building, which we completed in the first year of our practice. And this was part of the Hull City of Culture, who were trying to make sure that the event reached every young person in the city. And there's those of you who don't know Hull, there's obviously a fairly tight urban centre, but there's a large suburban and sort of non-urban kind of sprawl to the city. And a lot of those young people are completely disengaged with the kind of cultural epicentre, particularly of the City of Culture. And one school was a pupil referral unit for pupils who had been excluded from mainstream school, but was residential, only one of two residential schools. And they'd been given this rather underused allotment space, which was underused really because at the time they weren't particularly interested in horticulture, but they were interested in that as a respite from their space. And their brief, or the city's brief to us, was to help them design a new shed. And our processes always start with very tactile, very direct, hands-on processes which everyone can understand. Model making is at the centre of that. This is the first workshop. And over a period of 3 months, that process evolved very directly. This is Connor on the first day, meeting him, explaining to the engineer at Price & Myers how he wanted his shed to be a much more dynamic structure than we'd imagined. And I think one of the things that this made us realise was that the young people's imagination, if you temper that within the context of the constraints of sort of cost and time and explain to them those things, they're able to kind of fully imagine completely adventurous ideas. And these are a series of models of theirs leading to sort of typologies that will work through with them over a period of time to make a very, well, their exact words were very slick shed that opened up, that could be used principally as a sort of hangout space, a classroom space, a respite from their working environment. We work in a way where we work with young people over a period of time, anywhere from 3 months to about 6 months designing and considering their structures, but we always build our structures in a week, so they have to have particular processes. In this case, we worked with ways of building very quickly with timber frame, but also with innovative use of rubber paint on ply, which allowed us to weathertight and make weathertight and complete a kinetic movable structure. Here you see on the bottom left the open up part of the structure. And it's these experiences that give these young people an opportunity to express themselves and take ownership of place. And this project was really catalytic to that. This is the mayor opening it up after 5 long days. And then when we came back a couple of months later, and it's really become theirs, and that's the most important thing. It's about them taking ownership of them. This is the young people showing people around from the city of culture from Coventry, showing off their space to the world, which is wonderful. We go very quickly through Whitechapel, which is sometimes our projects are becoming much larger now, and to a scale where we can't completely build them, but we engage those young people in processes which allow them to express their ideas. In this case, it was an idea for a new community art space within a school in Poplar, which has been part of the Exhibition of Britain in 1951, post-war kind of planning, and lovely tiles by Peggy Angus, who was a creative artist who saw art as the centre of education and was involved in putting a lot of these artworks in schools. And we spent 12 weeks with a group of young people, thinking with them, going through the processes of architectural kind of design, from planning to thinking about the frame, the structure and the skin of that enclosure, to make ideas that were going to be then expressed and exposed in an exhibition at the Whitechapel Gallery, which was viewed by just under 100,000 people over a 3-month period. So this idea of working collaboratively and collectively, these are slides here you see now of the students thinking about the skin of their building, three-dimensionalizing, if you like, Peggy Angus tiles, and taking those from paper cutouts, which are inspired by her tiles in the hall, to these clay pieces, and working collaboratively often with industry kind of partners, in this case, Darwin Terracotta, who helped them transform these ideas through our processes into an incredible set of tiles, which is now going to cover the final building. As I said, the building, we've developed processes as much as, and we've designed processes as much as buildings. In this case, this was the system to allow them to manufacture a moment of that space and oculi, roof light in the gallery. And again, doing that over a period of 3 or 4 days in the gallery context. And I think something which will place important on what we do is kind of raising and elevating those processes to a sort of higher level. This was an early model that sort of iterated that idea of the skylight. And then now that's turning into a real building which has planning permission and is due on site now in 2021.
Thanks, Matt. I'm going to see if I can now share my screen and take over. Fingers crossed. Has that worked?
I think so.
Yep. So we're very aware that these opportunities should be provided to as many young people as possible, and so we were very proud to be able to work with a school called Phoenix School, who we've had a relationship with in various capacities over the last 10 years. Phoenix School is a school for young people with autism, and they were, unfortunately, the number of young people with autism in Bow is going up, and so there is a need for the school to expand. And so they were moving to the site of a former school which had this quite depressed outdoor space, and they wanted these young people to feel a sense of ownership of moving there in a familiarity with the space that they're going to, which is particularly important for young people with autism. And so this was a particularly ambitious project that the school asked if we could work with every student in the school to empower them in this way and to give them a voice to make a mark on their new playground at this Meanwhile school. And so these are the models that every young person in the school made. It includes both primary and secondary age students. And it was based on this idea of a modular element that we knew that we would be able to scale up. So having made these small tabletop models, we then do what we often call the paper build, where we scale up. And so a smaller number of young people worked at identifying their favourite themes from across the models, and then we supported them to build those at a larger scale, a half scale, so that they would get a sense of what the spaces feel like that they're designing. Following the period of the young people designing and building, we then go through this process of taking their ideas, and as Matt says, we try and move away from the idea of competition to something that includes all of the young people's ideas and the main themes that come through. And so we came to a design which included elements of every single young person's design, so that there would be aspects that were familiar to them. And then again, a group of young people from the school built this over the course of a week, which was hugely ambitious, but everyone rose to the challenge, and we're very lucky that with the projects we do, they seem to appeal to a large number of students and community groups and people of all ages who support the young people to build, realise their design. So this was sort of on day 2, beginning to put again these modular elements together, which then attach to the timber frame in the new playground. And this project crossed 2 terms. So the term before, the summer term, was before the children and young people had arrived on this new school site, and then they were now building it having arrived at the school site. So it's become this point of familiarity for them, which is a really important sort of touchstone. And every here we're drilling holes so that every young person could make a token that they could fix onto the structure. So it's literally emblematic of the whole school community. And this we built this with the young people 2 years ago. It's now, the hope is that it will move to the eventual new school site that the school will have for the full number of new students at the school. Last summer, we were approached by an amazing organisation called Institute of Imagination, who do exactly what their name says. They believe that all young people should be given the right to use their imagination and to bring their imagination to life. Currently, Institute of Imagination are in various Meanwhile sites, but they are hoping to have a permanent home. And again, given what they do is for young people, they felt very strongly that it needed to not only be briefed and designed by young people, but elements of it should be built by them as well. So again, this was a project that was ambitious in terms of bringing 4 different schools again together from Lambeth, and enabling them to decide what is a family makerspace, what does that mean, what do families and children want to be able to make first and foremost, and then what kind of spaces do they need to do that. And the proposal came up with essentially, originally it had been perceived as a journey, and the young people were saying, well, no, we don't want it to be a journey where you have to just go in one linear direction. We want to be able to go backwards and forwards, test out one part of the Maker Lab, go to another, come back to where we began. So they completely reconfigured any ideas of the brief that we or Institute of Imagination had. And they were also very aware that it was a large space and wanted to be able to fill that volume and make smaller spaces with these aerial structures. So we came up again with a series of ways that we could translate the children's designs into modular systems of both these aerial structures and then these base ground structures that would create these different rooms that are suitable for different types of making activities, robotics, coding and mechanics. And then we built with those young people, we built the Mega Maker Lab over the course of a week last summer, again using simple timber construction. And this is the final, go forward. This is the final makerspace. So it was open for a month during the summer in this Meanwhile space, which is a former fire engine fixing shed that's owned by developers you and I. And then at the end of that month of it being open, in the region of about 5,000 people visited it and made use of it, of all ages. The elements were able to be taken down, taken apart, flat packed, ready to be used again on the new site that Institute of Imagination will be moving to. And then finally, we just wanted to give you a glimpse of a project which is very dear to us and that we've had to put temporarily on hold. But we have been working with formerly known as Oval House, now Brixton House, which is a community theatre based in South London. And their previous executive producer had been a mentor for us for many years and had wanted to see if it was possible to hatch a plan that when they moved from Oval to Brixton, they were very keen that this was not a theatre that would land from above in this new community, but would be very grassroots and developed by the next generation in Brixton. So we work and continue to work with a group of young people to come up with, well, what is a performance space? What does that mean, first and foremost, to children and young people before even getting to the stage of designing it? Again, it's on the site next to the, so there is a theatre building that's going ahead that's being built by professional team, if you want to call them that, and then there's this theatre space designed and built by young people for young people, which is happening concurrently further along on the site. So this is the site where it's due to be built. It used to be a former school site. And again, we went through a series, first of all, of briefing what this is, visiting lots of different spaces, taking the young people out, giving them the opportunity to see different examples of performance spaces, such as the Yard Theatre in Hackney Wick, Wayne McGregor's Dance Studio, Here East, to see the robotics, to ensure that their eyes are open to what's possible, and that they're not encouraged necessarily to go for the most conservative option. And then they came and looked in depth at the site, worked out which part of the site that they particularly wanted to use for performance, and then using collage, continue to develop the character of the space, some of the kind of activities. I mean, what does performance mean to young people in the 21st century when you have YouTube? And so it very much needed to be a space that would enable both the digital and the physical. And this was all pre-coronavirus, which is slightly ironic. And then through a series of models, they continued to express their ideas that it needed to be a space that would be adaptable, that would have this kind of central area that could bring people together, but that could also allow for smaller breakout spaces. If, for example, if you're more of a shy performer and you don't want to stand in front of a big audience, and also things that would break down that nature of audience and performer and be quite playful. So we quite often use these sort of heat diagrams to work out the commonalities of the children's designs, to again make sure that what the eventual design is something that relates to all of the young people. And then again, we did a paper build, and we think this is a really important part of enabling young people to get first-hand experience of what it is that they've designed and have the opportunity to reflect on that and change if necessary. So this happened back in December, building this series of pavilions, 4 pavilions that come together around a central space, and that really has set the tone for the final design, which now has planning permission. So there's always a period of time that now in our wisdom we give ourselves between the final design workshop with the children and young people and when we actually come to build with them, firstly to get the permissions, the planning permissions, to meet building regulations, and to ensure that we can do complete justice to their imaginations and what they've come up with. So this is their design for the young people's performance space in Brixton. which is this series of 4 pavilions around a central space with some elements that move, that enable adaptability and changing the degree of privacy or aspect that it's public. And it's completely accessible. So again, it's very interesting asking young people what they want. They want space to be completely fair. So it's something that's universally accessible, which has 100% come from them. And I will see if this will play. Hopefully this might play. Let's see. May not. I might need to, hopefully we can share the presentation afterwards. But the space again has been, the design of it has been broken down in a way that it can be built over the course of a week by the group of young people and various volunteers and community groups who wanted to support. We were due to build in the first week of April. Very sadly, we got to the middle of March still hoping it might happen, and we've of course had to put the brakes on. But we remain in touch with the young people, with Brixton House, and we've been getting in touch with them to do various activities in the digital realm over the past few months, and we hope to build and realise their vision next spring. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matt and Fiona. That was really inspiring to see the kind of work that you guys are doing. Okay, we'll, as I said, take questions at the end. So we'll now move on to John Kinsley of John Kinsley Architects. I'll just do a brief introduction to John. I won't pretend that these are my own words. These are John's very eloquent words that he sent through as an introduction. After working on Walter Segal self-builds at the Centre for Alternative Technology in Wales as a student, undertaking the Bass Street Collective Custom Build project in Portobello 30 years later represented a reunion with a first love following a diverse career encompassing, amongst other projects, a passionate 10-year fling with the Scottish Parliament building. John will talk about how the CCB process can be used by communities across Scotland to provide beautiful, affordable and sustainable homes and neighbourhoods, and how architects are ideally placed to assist this transformation. I'll welcome John now to share his screen and start once he feels ready.
Thanks very much, Gary, for that introduction, and thanks Matt and Fiona for your slides as well. So hopefully everyone should be able to see that now.
Yeah, that's working.
It was lovely seeing your slides, Matt and Fiona. I can only imagine how much joy and how much pleasure and fulfillment you got out of working with the children on those projects. I think working on actual physical self-build projects as a team is one of the most joyous things that we can do in life, and certainly my experiences of working as a student on the Walter Segal stuff was really formative for me, and it's something, the actual physical self-build side of things, that I'd really love to get back to at some point. So unfortunately, that process of hands-on shaping the spaces that we live and work and play in with architects and with the users of those spaces is not the norm. The vast majority of the houses that we live in the UK are procured by volume house builders whose motivation is profit, not quality. And there's a lovely quotation there from Alain de Botton: house builders con the public into buying hugely overpriced rubbish, the architectural equivalent of the turkey Twizzler, which is quite a nice way of summarising it. So as well as having no end user involvement in these projects, of course, there's very rarely any architectural involvement. So we've known for a long time that if you want to build good homes, the people that are going to live in them need to be involved in that process. So this is a book that was written by John Turner in 1973, almost 50 years ago. We're still trying to get there and still not making anywhere near as much good process as we should be doing, particularly in the UK. So if people want to make their own homes, how can they be better? And these next few slides, I'll reference some photographs of our project in Portobello in Edinburgh. So ask someone what they want from a home, and two of the first words that they'll say is, we want space and we want light, we want tall ceilings, we want big windows. But none of the volume house builders give people that. People will say we want to have some control over the environment. We want to be able to occupy it and fit it out and it to be bespoke and special for our needs. So getting in at the start of the process as part of a collective build is a great way of being able to do that. Being able to have a home that is flexible, that can be adapted as we grow old, as we change, depending on how we live in it. So here is a floor plan of one of the flats in our Bath Street development. It's a tenemental floor plan with a central stair here, but the flats have got two entrances off into a donut shape, 3 bedrooms across the front here, living plan, open plan, living, dining, kitchen across the back here. So that means that we can divide it down at some point if we want to do that. So this space in blue here could be subdivided down as a separate unit, or we could split the accommodation up into 2 L-shaped units as well, depending on how circumstances change over time. All of the groups that we've spoken to over the last 2 or 3 years, when we ask them how they want to build, they all say we want to build more sustainably. So one of the first things that we set out with our project in Portobello was we want 0 fossil fuels in the building. We don't want to take gas in at all. It's 100% electric. It's insulated to passive house standards, airtight, mechanical ventilation, heat recovery. So there's no central heating, no need for heating in there. It's electric cooking, electric water heating, and that electricity is sourced from companies that provide 100% renewable energy. When you build in smaller groups as well, we have an opportunity to be able to build in a more innovative way. So the big volume house builders are extremely risk averse. So the opportunity to be able to innovate, even when that innovation is entirely appropriate, is something that they seem very reluctant to embrace. Innovation was something we were interested in. We're particularly interested in the idea of being able to use cross-laminated timber, which lends itself really, really well to a kind of tenemental scale of architecture where we're building to 4 stories. In building in wood rather than in, let's say, a steel frame with concrete floors, which might have been a more conventional structure to use. We sequestered 114 tons of CO2 in the frame, so that's about 11 years worth of CO2 emissions for a typical UK resident. We saved a whole chunk of money in preliminaries because we were able to build much more quickly than we would have been able to build conventionally. And we were able to build more accurately and also more healthily as well. We're also able to be flexible in terms of the approach to the project. So although we weren't physically doing the nuts and bolts of the construction ourselves, we weren't wielding hammers and saws in erecting the CLT frame, we were able to say to the main contractor, once we got to approximately a kind of shell stage, that for some of the flats, those of us that felt confident and competent to do so, that we could do some of the fit out work ourselves. So an element of sweat equity in terms of providing finishes, in terms of building partitions, putting in kitchens and bathrooms and so on and so forth, enables to keep the costs down for the people that were living there. Fundamentally, one of the biggest differences between building as a resident-led community group and procuring a building like this through a conventional route using a house builder or a developer is that the people that are going to live there are making an investment in the neighborhood that a conventional route with a private developer isn't making. So a private developer is motivated, as I mentioned earlier, to maximize his or her profit in the project, to reduce the specification by as much as they can possibly get away with, to reduce the quality by as much as they can get away with, and to walk away with a bag of money at the end of the project that's as big as it can be. So when groups are building themselves, they're motivated to build to as high a quality as they possibly can, not just because they want to live in a beautiful home, but because they want to invest in the neighborhood that they're living in. They want to be able to walk out of the front door in the morning with their heads held high, proud of what they've achieved. So inherently, allowing community-led, resident-led groups to develop sites and neighborhoods will result in neighborhoods which are of higher quality than if they are built by private developers and private house builders. And that's a really, really important point, I think, and one that needs to be made incessantly, I think, to local authorities, to try to persuade them to free up sites and land for groups to build their own houses on. The other point associated with that last one in terms of building to higher levels of quality is community-led groups are motivated to cherish the buildings that they build, to love them and care for them and maintain them and look after them to a far greater degree than if those buildings have been produced by somebody else and the residents have just been parachuted in with no real influence or say in how the buildings have been procured. So how do architects help with that process of community-led, resident-led development? So with a little bit of a nod to the topic of tonight's talk in terms of alternative models of architectural practice, this is a kind of equivalent of the RIBA plan of work that I produced for community groups, describing what needs to happen at each stage of the process and how your architect can help you with that process and what kind of results need to be achieved during that process. So I guess the key differences with the standard RIBA plan of work probably sit in that first column in terms of inception and briefing. I might expect to actually get more involved in terms of procuring land, finding land for community groups, and helping groups to actually come together, constitute themselves, decide whether they should be set up as a cooperative or as a company limited by guarantee, for example, what the different models are that are appropriate for their constitution, and also helping them to source the fund for their project. And potentially as well undertaking some early stage development appraisals to establish that the project is feasible, that the people that are undertaking it can afford it, and really getting everything over the start line so that there's a feasibility proposal scheme in place that maybe has gone through a wee bit of pre-planning with the local authority. There's some funding in place, the group's constituted, and there's a piece of land that there's a sale agreed on, all ready to go and all ready to march over the line. And then from that starting point, so from the end of that kind of inception, briefing, feasibility, design process, through the remaining stages is really a conventional plan of work type process where the building project is not really any different from a conventional one. Yeah, potentially there's the opportunity for getting residents involved earlier on, finishing off their own homes, their own dwellings, getting involved in a little bit of sweat equity. I would say that managing that process as an architect is probably a more intense process, let's say, than managing a conventional, traditional contract on site. But there's nothing in this process that we can't do as architects. And I think that really brings me on to this next slide. And I like the analogy of the architect as a conductor. I think as architects, we're all jacks of all trades, if you like. I think whenever we engage with a professional during a construction project, whether it's an engineer or a quantity surveyor, we're almost always inevitably talking to someone who has more expertise in that subject than we have. So we're listening to people from these different professional backgrounds, and we're making value judgments on what they're telling us, and we're assessing all of that and balancing out the inputs of a structural engineer with a building services engineer, with a quantity surveyor, with a planner, with a carpenter on site, with a bricklayer, with an electrician, and so on and so forth, in the same way that a conductor brings into play the various instruments within an orchestra. And I think particularly being involved with community groups and resident-led groups of people that aren't professional clients, that don't have that experience of procuring buildings, really puts the architect at the center of the process, and puts us right back in that position as leader of the design team, central to the whole construction project, which is perhaps a role that maybe we've let slip or has been usurped from us over the last or so, with the rise of design and build contracts and PFI and other things like that. So I'm really, really excited about how projects like Bath Street, how community-led projects like that can really let us engage let us use the skills that we've got and let us work to the best of our ability with projects. So I've dropped this in just to talk about very briefly some of the other projects that we're working on at the moment. So Bath Street on the left there, completed summer 2017. We've been keen to try and make Bath Street type community-led projects work across the whole spectrum of affordability. So we've been engaged with Edinburgh Council and other councils in terms of how we can apply the collective custom build process to an affordable client, and also talking to one or two other councils, even in some cases out with Scotland, about how we can make that work, as well as looking at more conventional, let's say, owner-occupier schemes in other parts of town as well. So my aspiration over the next few years is to actually move beyond. So what I've been talking about so far this evening has been substantially around qualitative aspects relating to the dwelling itself, and how a collective custom build process can make individual dwellings better. But of course, as you all know, one of the real areas where as architects we can engage and we can make housing better is in terms of placemaking. Make no excuses for using an example from Peter Aldington, Turn End. So this is the house that Peter still lives in himself. Probably no architect more skilled than Peter Aldington at grouping houses together. And in a slightly larger context, the whole idea of collective custom build, whilst it might be relatively innovative for us here in the UK, is absolutely standard and quite normal in other parts of the world. So this is, I think, a slide from Freiburg in Germany. So again, being able to move the ideas that I've described on to a neighbourhood scale is something that I'd really love to see happen here in Scotland. And the opportunity of being able to design the kind of neighbourhoods that we see in Freiburg and in Tübingen and in some other places, other examples in Germany. The Germans seem to be particularly good at this sort of thing. Is something that I'd really love to see us being able to do here. The last slide that I've dropped in here again is really partially in response to the title of tonight's talk, Alternative Models of Architectural Practice. So the conversations that I've had with resident groups over the last couple of years or so, a lot of groups are saying that there are funding gaps, and that availability of finance is one of the big issues that gives groups real difficulties moving forward. And for any typical development, commercial lenders, banks, building societies will typically lend something of the order of 60 to 70% of the overall costs. And finding those remaining 30 to 40% can be quite difficult, and groups can really get into a bit of a scramble trying to find that finance. So together with a colleague with a background in ethical property, we are looking to set up an organisation which will be able to provide that finance to community-led groups, in addition to some of the other services that we've been able to provide as John Kinsley Architects, so design services and some of the other issues about constitution and land finding and so on. So that's something that we're still working on at the moment. So this is an extract from our website, which is hot off the press. I think this has been live for about 3 or 4 days. It's something we're very, very excited about being able to get involved with. And I finished off with a quote from John Ruskin, when love and skill come together, expect a masterpiece, which is a lovely quote. I think, as mentioned with reference to Matt and Fiona's work at the start of this evening, love is such a hugely important component in everything that we do, and I think it's almost impossible to design a building as an architect without having a client that is in love with the process and in love with what's coming out of the process. So being able to engage and bring that love from the client with the skills that we all provide as architects is such an important thing. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Sean. That was great. Okay, so next we have Akiko Kobayashi. I'll give Akiko a quick introduction and then I can ask her to share her screen in one moment. Akiko Kobayashi is an Edinburgh-based architect who currently supports a number of third sector clients in Edinburgh and the Lothians. Previous projects have included facilitation of self-build adventure playgrounds and feasibility for co-housing groups. Akiko sits on the board of several local organisations and is a co-founder of the Architecture Fringe. Her main area of interest in the built environment is community land ownership, as reflected in her active involvement in the Astley Ainsley Community Trust. She has worked in architectural and engineering practices in London, Sydney, Tokyo and Edinburgh, and has studied at Cambridge, Dundee and Edinburgh in between. So let us welcome Akiko to share her screen and just to get started whenever you're ready.
Hi everyone, good evening, and thanks to the EAA for having me. Gary, just timing wise, can I check how long may I allow?
About 20 minutes. We're probably going to run over a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah, that's fair. You know.
Okay, so I can keep it fairly tight because I'm interested in everyone's questions and a bit of discussion as best we might be able to manage it online. Let me just minimise that for myself. Okay, alternative models of architecture practice was something that I probably found a little bit difficult to get my head around in terms of deciding what I could contribute. I've borrowed these 2 words from an article in this month's Rebirth journal actually, and you know, one big opportunistic adventure I think is possibly a way of describing the manner in which my practice has panned out. So I'd like to talk about 2 threads specifically tonight, I think. I'll tell a story of a community land ownership project, but there's a parallel thread there as well, which is about the role of the architect in these kinds of community land ownership projects and actually community group projects at all, you know, when the work is speculative or pro bono or just done for free because it's work that's in your locality. You know, you are a citizen of that neighborhood. So to give my practice a bit of context, you know, I was asked what led you to where you're at now. I've worked on buildings of a variety of scales, large ones, medium-sized ones, heritage, culture, and then smaller domestic ones as well as a sole practitioner. I kind of drifted towards self-build. I would have loved to have done a Seagull build 30 years ago, but luckily we have brilliant things like Tog Studio at the running now. This is over in Tyree. This was the boathouse, and some self-builds on domestic things as well. The mini digger is my favourite. I've done a few things, but obviously I love the mini digger. I love the groundworks. And a few years ago, I think some of you probably maybe helped me out with this, and you've maybe heard about it already as well. It's the Fountain Bridge Wiki House in Edinburgh. Lots of people got to use a CNC machine, and the build was over the course of 3 days on the weekend. This is the frame. This is the end of day one here on the left, and this is many weeks later on the right, with the input of lots of different people, actually different practitioners, taking ownership of different parts of it, like the cladding and the decking and things. Other things that were happening on that site is this kind of junk playground stuff that I love, giving power tools to really quite small children, keeping things quite simple and DIY, and most of all, I suppose, tactile and movable. And you know, that is all part of having the freedom to manipulate your own environment as well. And hopefully for the Edinburghers, some of you have also come along to Woodland Tribe, of which I am a team member. This was on the Meadows in Edinburgh a few years ago. We've done it a couple of times in Edinburgh. We did it in Mull last year, and this was Brighton the year before. These kids, this is all stuff that kids have built. This was over the course of a few weeks actually, but this one is just up for 3 days. As you can see, people writing their names on all these planks here. What I've got on the drawing board at the moment is a few projects, but the main one on site is the Pregnancy and Parent Centre, which is due to open as soon as lockdown easing of restrictions allows. This is over in the Pleasance, and also a women's enterprise hub, the business hub, for a partnership of 2 or 3 women's charities together. So I feel like I'm trying to contextualize this work that might be seen as alternative within a practice that does plenty of conventional stuff, feasibility studies, building warrant applications, all those kinds of things that you're all familiar with as well. So in thinking about an alternative model, I'm not wanting to put this forward as a model of practice at all, I suppose. So I don't think I necessarily call it an alternative model of practice, but it is mainly along the lines of my interest in community land ownership that I seem to always be drawn back to. This is a picture of the common at the top of the hill where I grew up. And I don't think I can really mention community land ownership without giving a shout out to Andy Whiteman's book, which explained a lot of things to me actually that I've been wondering about in terms of not simply land ownership, but territory and control and all those things that go along with it as well. And now we're thinking about these things within urban contexts as well, and not just rural Scotland. So the project I tell you about, I think I'm going to keep it fairly brief because there are a lot of technical aspects to it, and that's another talk in itself, or you're quite welcome to ask me about those things another time if you find yourselves in the same situation. This is the Sick Kids Hospital, the Royal Hospital for Sick Children in Edinburgh, obviously fondly known as the Sick Kids. And what's relevant here is the Community Empowerment Scotland Act of 2015 and secondary legislation of this Act, which reenacted part of the Land Reform 2003 Act. The secondary legislation came into force April 2016. And the mechanism that it described was community right to buy, which was in the 2003 Act, I think, but specifically in 2016, it became applicable to urban areas. You might have heard people also talk about community asset transfer. That's a slightly different mechanism that came in a year later. That's a different part of the Community Empowerment Act. Very quickly, community right to buy can be applied to privately owned land and publicly owned land. Community asset transfer can only be applied to publicly owned land, so land that's owned by the government or the council or the MOD or Police Scotland, all these kinds of bodies. And obviously we were very, very inspired by the work of Action Porty and their Belfield Church project, which had happened just a few months before we became aware of the opportunity at Sick Kids, and they've just always been really generous and supportive with sharing their learning and experience and things, which is another important thread with community group projects, I think. And I think Matt and Fiona also mentioned that as well, in terms of sharing knowledge between these groups that are involved in these kinds of projects. So if we sweep into the map, for those of you who are not familiar with Edinburgh, this is Arthur's Seat up here. This, under my Zoom controls, is the station. And this is the Meadows here. This is the Sick Kids Hospital, just here. In fact, I live just here. And it is in the process of moving out to the new premises, which is right out here in Little France, with the rest of the new build hospital facilities. It was built in 1895. This kind of configuration here is probably something you'll recognise from a lot of hospitals from around that time across Edinburgh, and well, also in Glasgow as well. I'm thinking of the south side. And the whole plot is the main building here, but you can see these historic townhouses and terraces that have actually got absorbed into the site now. There's various and actually other kind of clinical practices, I think, happening in these ones, and all these support facilities as well. This is specifically the Children's A and E ward, which was built in the 1990s thanks to a huge public fundraising appeal. I've seen the booklet actually of all sorts of things that were happening, like the world's largest conga on the Meadows, and here's a letter of support from Clarence House. So obviously, as a children's hospital, it's a hugely important part of lots of people's lives, and so many people had stories of how the hospital had been there for them, going from way back actually, when we had our public meetings. There were lots of these stories emerged. When it was known that it was coming up for sale, the Community Council put on various public meetings. We had speakers from PAS, we had speakers from the NHS to come and inform us, and they also ran an engagement event. You know, it's a kind of visioning thing, and the Community Council produced this document, which was a summary of collective views. But within the crowd, there were also some people who had heard about Action Porty and who were curious about the new community empowerment legislation, and were really interested in potential community ownership of the hospital site and grounds as well. And there are these brilliant, easy to read guidebooks that Scottish Government's produced that sit side by side with the more detailed legislation. And the idea that was emerging amongst some people who were interested in community land ownership here were things like community healthcare, cooperative housing, and business spaces. No surprise really. I don't think, you know, these are the things that one might expect local people to be interested in when we talk about community-owned assets. So as a group, we made some flyers. We asked for as many of the leaflets that the government could give us, the community land team of the government actually, and we organised our own public meeting where we did our best to explain what we understood about the legislation and the mechanism. And it's very evident that you know, there were lots of questions, but there was a huge amount of support as well. So we decided to do the legislative stuff. These are the Articles of Association of what became the Marchmont and Sheens Development Trust. This is to do with incorporating in a way that we're compliant with using the legislation. There are rules as well do with membership. 75% of the members have to live within a certain area that you defined as being the local area. Plus, we needed a petition as well. So not a change.org kind of click online, but really a physical petition. So we had an army of people go out and knock on doors and explain the situation. And we had the petition sitting in local shops as well, so that people could go there and sign it. And we had a whole raft of letters of support as well, political support and support from various organisations. Our MSP brought it up at FNQs because, in fact, no, I won't go into it, but yeah, this was the level that it was being discussed at as we were getting our application together. So according to this guidebook, this is the kind of process that we should expect. You incorporate, you get your application together, you get 15% in our case of the local community expressing support for the application, the various timelines that go with it, and various things that kick in to do with prohibition of sale and the exercising of community right to buy. What's happening here is actually a registration of community interest in land, and that's a cabinet secretary matter that the community land team puts forward to her on your behalf. The reality was that the process was a bit more like this. This is what I've mapped out. So this is our first public meeting. This is us getting our paperwork together, and you can see here that what this icon is indicating is not quite a refusal. I'm gonna get to that in a second, but this bit here, there was comments. Frustratingly, because the site was already on the market, we didn't have recourse to respond to those comments. I've got a lot of my own comments on those comments. Again, I'm quite happy to share that in another talk. But the ministerial decision was a declination to consider our application. The reason being that despite being under the impression that this was the extent of the site and that it was owned by the NHS and submitting with this map, it was not the case. It was owned by two owners, so NHS Lothian and the Edinburgh Lothians Health Foundation, and therefore our application was deemed to be not valid. So this is, as you can see, really quite a long story. We set about trying to get these maps sorted. It wasn't clear from the ground what belonged to who. What we eventually discovered was that the two ownerships tessellated in such a manner, and you got very bizarre situations such as number 1 and 1A Rillbank Terrace. The NHS owned both floors of number 1, but number 1A was owned by two owners. And we needed to get this stuff absolutely right, because otherwise it could trip up our application again. So that's that. We got our two maps sorted. We used our petition and we put it in again. There was a technicality, a declination to consider based on a technicality that happened again. I'm going to save that for another talk, I think, which I have actually, I've spoken about all this to other community groups and groups of lawyers and things previously, so I'm happy to share that within another forum. But what happened was our signatures ran out and we had to run the petition again, and by which time it became too late. The site was eventually sold. You can see we had our public meeting in February. September, it was sold to a student housing developer, and I believe the sum was £20 million. Yes, that was the result. I've actually written a summary of everything that happened, and I've published it, but I've also made a little bit link here in case you're interested in seeing is it's what happens chronologically in various columns of who did what and when, what we can learn from it. So you're quite welcome to go there, download it, and inspect the detail in your own time. But that is a very, very distilled version of what you can probably tell is quite a complicated story. But I'm going to kind of draw us back to architecture and architectural practice now. And I've been asked lots of questions about this before, and I've kind of, I suppose it's prompted a lot of questions for myself as well. So, you know, I'm interested in talking about or discussing, hearing from other people, what is the role of the architect in these kinds of projects, or what was the role of the architect in community land ownership, which is obviously a much bigger nationwide campaign. And I've kind of got a note of all sorts of questions that I know I've been asked, and the kind of discussions that I've had with other people. And so beyond this specific issue of community land ownership, there are obviously questions, if we're talking about models of practice, is it a valid way of practicing? Does it relate to practice in other more conventional situations? To what extent are we prepared to do speculative work? You know, why would you even do work like this? Why would you work for free? Do architects get involved in these things with an expectation of a paid commission further down the line, or are there other motivations involved? There are also questions, I suppose, to do with when architects do engage in pro bono work, what impact does it have on the rest of the local industry and the profession? You know, does it undermine other practices getting to take part in these things? You know, and we can also say, if that architect working for free wasn't doing the work, who else would be doing the work? It wouldn't necessarily be another architect who had a means of getting paid to do it. Can we quantify the monetary value of this unpaid work? You know, in a sense, does it create opportunities for other architects for further stages? And I have been asked before as well, how can I afford to do this work for free? If anyone's interested in talking about these things, I would love to hear people's thoughts and further questions as well. And that's it.
Thank you so much, Akiko. That was so interesting. Okay, I believe we are going to invite some questions. So I think our Fiona, EAA Fiona, is going to take that. We're on about 7:20 now, but I see quite a lot of interesting questions here, so I'll let Fiona lead on that.
I'll just kind of go through go back to the start, I suppose, and go through them chronologically, and I suppose we'll come a full circle and come back to some of those questions that Akiko herself was asking. So Alice asked our first question, and it was for Matt and Fiona. So she's asking about, I suppose, the source or the client for your work. Is it generally educational bodies, or do you find that you're commissioned by small charities or private organisations? What would you say, sort of, or maybe there's not a general rule for it?
Matt, you want me to jump in and then add. Well, firstly, I want to also jump into the questions that are coming on later, which I think need to be answered first, about funding. That, to be absolutely clear, Matt and we don't work for free, and our staff don't work for free. And we wouldn't do these projects if we did, because that would undermine the whole industry. So when we talk about volunteers, we talk about volunteers very specifically working on builds for as much of the week as they're willing to give. And that we regularly evaluate that, and we hear that students in particular really appreciate the skills that they develop, which they don't develop or quite often don't have the opportunity to develop during architecture school. So first and foremost, I think that's a really important thing to say, and it's something that we feel very, very strongly about, is that in terms of project managers, architectural assistants, architects working on the project, everybody is paid, and paid at a good rate. That's not to say it's always been that case. I think starting up the initiative, our first project was crowdfunded, and that was because this was something that Matt and I felt hugely passionate about and wanted to do. And so we took that risk on our own backs of saying we're willing to put some time in for free to test this. Let's see if it works. And if it does, then we have proof of concept that we can take to future clients. And since then, we've been approached by multiple clients. Some of them are schools, so sometimes schools fund projects directly. Generally, schools don't have huge budgets. A lot of the work that we do with schools is actually paid for by cultural collaborators. So for example, the Whitechapel Gallery, Hull UK City of Culture, and in turn they fundraise. So we work very closely with the development teams in cultural organisations, so that the fundraising and the bill essentially is going to a trust or a foundation or a sponsor. What Matt and I do, as well as trying to support that process, is to bring in-kind support to the project through material sponsorship, which we've been very fortunate with so far, and we hope that that will continue. But we try and massively amplify the project budget through that. And as I say, we've been fortunate with that so far. We also get approached directly by developers, often to work on meanwhile spaces. We're very clear about our process is about empowering young people, and we cannot tell you what a project is going to produce at the outset, because that would fly in the face of what we believe in and what the projects are about. So we work with certain developers. We make clear that that's the basis we work on. Good developers understand that, and they see that as a real opportunity for them and something that they embrace. Occasionally other people run a mile, and that's fine, because we then know at the outset that's not the right partnership. So we're happy to kind of talk about that in more detail, but I would say commissions come quite broadly from both the education, the cultural world, developer sector, local authorities, and occasionally we will bring projects to the table. We'll approach partners and say, should we do something? But the first stage of that is, how are we going to fundraise for it?
Thank you. It was interesting. You actually answered a few other questions that I had myself there, so it was a good answer. I don't know. I think that sort of answered what you were asking, didn't Alice?
Yes, yeah, no, it did. Thank you very much. I just was wondering where the commissions kind of come in from, etc. So that's really interesting, and it's a good mix of, you know, developer and education. It's quite positive to see that, or to hear it.
So there's a sort of twofold question here for John from Barry. He's asking a bit about the finance side of your projects. So the first part of the question is, how does the finance work when you are deciding that individual units are going to be completed by individuals at their pace rather than a contractor doing the whole lot? And the second part of the question is to do with the location, I suppose. He's saying, do you think that the opportunity was available to you on your Bath Street project because of the value of the plot itself, and therefore maybe less of a risk to lenders than a less valuable plot elsewhere? I'm hoping that I've summarised that well enough, but I'll just mute myself and let you answer.
Okay, thanks Fiona. Thanks Barry for the question. The first question, if I've understood that correctly, essentially there's a little bit of just complicated maths at the end of the project, reconciling the costs. So it's relatively straightforward. If you're working with a contractor who's got an open book costing price to work out how the costs can be split across specific items. Typically the way we work things on Bath Street was the elements of the project, the kind of shell elements of the project that the main contractor built, were prorated on a square metre area. And then the kind of bespoke elements of the project, like kitchen fit out and bathroom fit out and things like that, if they were done by the main contractor rather than the resident, then they were just costed separately and added onto the bill for the resident. So that's how that side of things worked. On the economics, the cost of the land at Bath Street, it was market rate, so it wasn't any cheaper than it would have been otherwise. One of the big advantages of building collectively like this is because there isn't a developer involved, there's no developer's profit in the financial equation. So effectively, you're building you're buying your house at a cost price. So you may be saving 20% or so against market value. There's a fair bit of leeway in there that enables you to either save money against what you might pay for a home that's been built to a comparative level of specification that you're buying from a developer, or you might decide that we'll actually build to a slightly higher quality and up the specification slightly. Yeah, land value wasn't really an issue on that one. As I mentioned in the talk, one of the challenges is trying to make it work in terms of plugging that 30 to 40% finance gap. We had a lot of interest in our project from young people and first-time buyers that were really intrigued with the idea, really interested in the innovation in terms of the approach. But when we said to them, you'd need to find 30% of the value of the flats, they just said, sorry, we can't do that. We've not got that kind of equity. So unfortunately, a lot of people that would otherwise have been really interested in the process just had to pull out. And those are people that would have been able to afford the mortgage at the end of the process. They just couldn't procure the equity capital that was needed to undertake the build. So hence some of the thinking about trying to find ways of being able to finance that ourselves to open the process up to people that haven't got that equity. Does that answer the question, Barry? Hopefully, yeah. Thanks.
Thanks, John. I've got another question here for you, which less mathsy. It's about how you started your practice, whether you've always had this sort of idea in the back of your mind or ambition. How did you sort of start out, and what kind of made you go in this direction?
Yeah, good question. I'm kind of a big fan of the John Lennon quotation about life is what happens to you when you're busy planning other things. Anybody that says they planned their career is telling a whopper of a fib, I think. The practice is relatively young, so it has grown out of Bath Street and is kind of founded on the idea of doing the collective custom build. That's not to say we don't do other stuff as well. That's a lot more conventional. But I'm pretty long in the tooth, and I've got a whole career of doing a whole host of other things on route. So yeah, I've done one or two other things in my time as well.
Okay, so there's a question here, and it's aimed at Matt and Fiona, but I wonder whether it's maybe relevant to everybody, about CDM regulations and working with children, but I suppose working with the public generally. Has that been much of a stopping block for anybody, or is it just something you kind of able to deal with quite naturally through the process?
Akiko, do you want to go in as you haven't spoken, or I can jump in quickly? I mean, from our point of view, some of our projects are quite building-like. Some of them are definitely not building-like. They're more sort of strange structures. But we have them, we risk assess them beforehand, and where CDM applies. We work with CDM team who help us risk assess those projects. And but with a direct question about young people working at height, it's one of the few restrictions that we have at the moment with our insurance. So we have no young people working at height. So the scaffolds that you've seen there with people on, they're young people, but they're young adults. They're our volunteers, and parts of our staff have gone through a training process before that construction week. So it's one of the few things. So we don't have young people up ladders or on scaffold. So very directly, that's how we answer that. But yeah, one of our challenges, and I think for us, was getting insurance for young people. You mentioned power tools and building sites, and if you're trying to do this sort of legit, and most insurers will turn away. There's not many policies out there which allow you to do that. We were really fortunate. The very first year we did this, we were supported with the first project was at a National Trust property, and they allowed us to piggyback on their insurance, their public liability and insurance, and that again, as Fee identified, sort of showed proof of concept to our current insurers, who are ecclesiastical insurers. Again, I'm happy to share that, but it's basically a sort of a youth group insurance that allows that use, I think, by a lot of people, sort of with working with young people on adventure playgrounds and things like that. So it's a sort of the only sort of tailor-made project solution that you can affordably buy.
Akiko, would you? Sorry, Fiona, on you go.
I don't have anything.
I was going to say. Just asking if Akiko wanted to comment on that. I don't know if you do, Akiko, or if we want to move on to some of the questions that you had that might be relevant for all the speakers. It would be quite interesting to discuss some of those, I think.
Yeah, we can keep moving on.
Fiona, are you gonna?
Sorry, I don't know if my internet was maybe not so good for a minute there. I was just saying maybe we could go back to some of the questions that Akiko herself had.
All right.
And we
Okay.
can maybe talk through some of those. I think we've covered most of the ones in the chat now. So I thought some of those would be quite interesting to involve all the speakers in, perhaps.
Okay.
Keep the questions coming in the chat though, if anybody has any more they want to ask, or if they've asked something they feel is not being answered.
I'm quite interested in maybe having a bit of a conversation with Matt, Fiona and John, particularly on this resolve of not working for free, which I totally agree. You know, I don't do planning applications or building warrant applications for free, feasibility studies for free. But when you're an interested local resident and there's a local initiative happening and all sorts of people are chipping in, not just architects, not even just designers, but well, in the Sick Kids group, we had a journalist, a financial investment person, some students, a club promoter. So we've all got skills. Where do we start feeling like this is pro bono work that's displacing potentially paid work for another consultant? Because actually we know that a lot of these projects don't have any money at all. It's completely volunteer fueled. And also being honest about why we're involved as well. You know, it's a built environment project that maybe other people don't necessarily see a pipeline for formal work coming out of it. But the kind of, if you're involved in a local community group, maybe John, you are as well in Portobello, I don't know, what, you know, they're having those declarations of interest at the start, and whether or not it's valid to expect to be put in some kind of preferential position by the time it gets to commissioning work. And I have been involved in groups as well where we have got grant funding, and we've been through tender processes and commissioned various other consultants, but I've always tried to keep that separate in terms of being on the client side and client advisor. I'd be interested to hear if any of the other speakers have got thoughts on that and how we navigate it, but how we still stay involved in that kind of thing, because it always makes our practice richer.
John, would you maybe like to comment?
Yeah, we're fitting it out a little bit there. I think probably my indication is not as good as it might be. I didn't catch all of that, but we don't work for free either. I think one of the advantages of working the way that we do is that being able to initiate projects ourselves means that we don't have a developer client going to be banging us over the head and driving our fees down. So we can set our fees ourselves, and within the context of a project where the client is saving 20% because there's no developer finance being taken out of it, the client is still getting good value, even though we might be charging a little bit more than if we were working for a commercially driven developer. So I think with the type of projects that we do, there's always some work that needs to be done to get things over the start line. So just simply finding land, bringing groups together and actually getting to the point where there is a project there in the first instance does involve quite a lot and quite a lot of time to pull all of that together. But again, I don't think that's necessarily something that sits out with traditional architectural practice. I know when I first came up to Scotland and worked for RMGM, and I remember at the time GM spending hours looking at potential sites for what is now the Scottish Government building down in Leith, to get that project off and running. So I think quite often there are requirements to get projects started before we can start getting paid. I think, perhaps one of your other questions, Akiko, there in terms of working with community groups. Again, I tend to certainly the community in Portobello is very, very active and does a lot of things, and I'm always very happy to get involved in initiatives as a community member in Portobello. So, for example, a couple of years ago, we undertook design charrettes in the town hall over a weekend, with myself and two of the local leading groups of people, imagining what we could do as a community with the in Portobello, and we'll. I'm free on that.
I think we're losing your connection quite a lot. It's jumping about quite a lot, John. I'm sorry. So we'll maybe stop you there.
Alice, can I just briefly jump in? I mean, I think our model is quite particular in the sense that a lot of the time our projects are seeded not in a kind of way that's kind of conventionally architectural practice, and all of the projects of we're supporting clients that come to us. So there's not that we haven't had if I'm honest, we haven't had a position where we're being asked to, or we're seeing opportunity that we're sort of self-establishing and we're being asked to do or consider that we might do it for free. I think the other thing that makes our business model kind of sustainable at the moment, and we're looking, and one of the positive sides of us actually having to stop a lot of live projects during lockdown and during COVID is actually stopping and having time to think about actually how we strategically plan for the next kind of few years. But we haven't mentioned, but we also our staff time for non-project time, which helps the wheels turn round and helps kind of promote what we do, make sure we do happens with more people, is we have what we call industry champions, and we're sponsored at the moment by the Happold Foundation, and Jessica and Wilds Architects. So they allow us to have spend time outside of direct project commissioning, which is something that is turning out to be invaluable. So it's like in the context of having a cash coming into an architectural practice that's not project related. It doesn't usually exist. I mean, unless you maybe have a sort of development wing within your architectural practices, we've got some other sort of income strand. So that's become, I mean, just for people to understand how we do what we do, that's part of that, and we're hoping to grow that kind of the role of those champions in helping, yeah, the machine run, if you like, and that's pretty important to that. Just as a parallel, I did see a really nice question that's come up from Ruth asking about one thing we might do to I think it's about bringing one change in education that would improve things. I think Fee might be better talking on this, but it's a really lovely question. I think we should put architecture on the national curriculum from year kind of, you know, well, from 5 years, from start of primary school. Fee spent 2 weeks last year in Finland, where architecture is on the national curriculum there, and in its widest gamut, you know, and I think that's something which we're championing. We're one of our project managers is taking a 6-month sabbatical to Helsinki currently with projects sort of here on hold to do a timber making course at the university there, and yeah, we're hoping to build really close bridges with the Architectural Institute there and the education team. Fee, I don't know if you want to add to that, because I think that's something which is really critical. It's really missing from the landscape at the moment, particularly over the last 10 years in the education landscape. Certainly in the UK, certainly in England. It may not be the case so much in Scotland.
I mean, I know recently there have been some amazing steps taken in Scotland to try and get architecture onto the curriculum, which is brilliant. And my experience, sort of separate to Matt and Fiona, I worked at the RIBA for many years setting up their national schools programme, and there is hunger from teachers for these types of projects. They see the value of project-based learning and learning that cuts across subjects. So I don't think you'd ever find a teacher who would ever turn an architect away if they came and said, we'd like to do a project with your students. The challenge, to say, is then how you fund that. Increasingly though, it's the case south of the border, a lot of schools have business development managers because of the nature that they are now essentially private companies if they're academies, and even if they're local authority schools, they need to fundraise in their own right. So you can have those conversations quite early on with the business development managers in the schools, who are very, very good at writing grant applications very broadly. For example, it's a developer that's helping to fund the project with Lansbury Lawrence Primary School in Poplar, and increasingly more and more schools have these kind of roles. So I think it would be wonderful to see the built environment, or in the broadest sense, the environment as a whole on the school curriculum. But in fact, a lot of good schools are already making amazing things happen because they recognise the value of this way of learning. And our constant concern is that it's those young people who are already perhaps in the least advantaged communities that lose out most if the schools don't have the additional resources or time to take part in these kind of projects. And that's definitely where our focus is, to reach those schools.
I think we're going to have to just wrap up a little bit now. I'm sorry that we didn't get some more time for questions, and we've just sort of run over a little bit, so apologies for that. And I'm just going to hand over to Gary to thank our speakers.
Yes, just a huge thank you. I kind of selfishly was part of pulling together this sort of series of talks based on the fact that I myself am a young practitioner and sort of 3 years into establishing my own practice, and all the sort of days of crippling self-doubt. It's an event like this where you hear from much more experienced architects than myself, And that I find that really inspiring, and it definitely puts a sort of a spring in my step and kind of helps me to move forward. So a huge thank you on sort of that aspect. But I will now, I think we're going to take everybody off mute, and I will invite everybody, all of our attendees, to just give a round of applause to our speakers this evening as a huge thank you. So that's all you'll hear from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much.